The last thing I expected, the morning I nearly died, was to hear my grandson's voice. He hadn't spoken a word in over a year. Not to his teachers, not to the counselors his mother paraded him past, not to me. And yet there he was, kneeling on the cold concrete of my workshop, shaking me by the collar, his voice cracking through the haze in my head. "Grandpa, get up, please get up. Mom did this. Mom's trying to kill you." I remember thinking I was dreaming. A boy who couldn't talk, talking. A boy who'd spent months curled quiet in the corner of every room, suddenly dragging a 200-pound man across a floor. But it wasn't a dream. It was the truth clawing its way out of a lie I'd been living in for the better part of a season. And by nightfall I would have to decide whether to hand my only child over to the police or protect her the way a father is supposed to, even when she'd stopped being anyone worth protecting. Before I go further, let me say this plainly, the way I'd want a stranger to say it to me. This is a fictional story about family, about trust, and about what betrayal does to the people who survive it. Any resemblance to real folks is coincidence. But if you've ever handed your whole heart to someone and later found out they were only measuring it for weight, you already know the truth underneath the story. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to learn far too late they were never who they claimed to be? Hold on to that feeling. You'll need it. Let me take you back to the beginning, or at least to where the ending started. My name is Roland Tate. I'm 68 years old, and for 40 of those years I ran freight up and down the spine of this country. Started with one truck and a bad transmission, ended with a company that hauled produce and lumber across 9 states. Tate Freight Lines. My wife used to laugh that I loved those rigs more than I loved sleeping in my own bed, and she wasn't entirely wrong. We built a place outside Bozeman, Montana, on a rise of land where you could see 3 ranges on a clear day. Colleen picked the spot. She said a person should wake up every morning to something bigger than their own problems. She died 4 years ago. Cancer, the fast kind, the kind that doesn't give you the courtesy of a long goodbye. After that, the house got quiet in a way I didn't have a name for. 240 acres and one old man rattling around in a log house built for a family that had scattered. Because we'd had a daughter, Marin, and Marin had left a long time before her mother got sick. 13 years ago, when she was 26, she came home for Thanksgiving with a man on her arm and a certainty in her eyes I'd learned to be afraid of. His name isn't worth much in this story, so I'll just tell you he was the kind of man who smiles at you while he's counting the exits. Colleen liked him fine. Colleen liked everybody. But I'd spent 4 decades reading men across freight yard tables, learning who'd shake your hand and who'd shake you down, and this one set every alarm I had ringing. I made some calls. That's a bad habit of mine, or maybe it saved my life more than once, hard to say. Within a week I knew he'd left 2 jobs under a cloud, that there was a woman in Spokane with a protective order she'd taken out, and then dropped, that he owed money to people you don't want to owe money to. I sat my daughter down at the kitchen table and laid it out. I thought facts would do the work. I was wrong about how facts work on a heart that's already decided. She stood up so fast the chair went over. Told me I'd never once believed she could choose right. Told me I saw danger everywhere because I trusted no one, not even her. And here's the part I've never told anyone until now. She wasn't entirely wrong about me. I was a hard man. I did keep the world at arm's length. Colleen was the warm one. I was the one who checked the locks. So when Marin accused me of trying to control her, some piece of it landed, and I let my own guilt make me quiet when I should have kept fighting. She married him anyway. Moved to Sacramento. Sent 1 Christmas card the first year, none the second, and then nothing. My grandson was born, and I found out from a mutual acquaintance 3 months after the fact. A boy. They named him Milo. I never held him. I never taught him to bait a hook or back a trailer, or any of the 10,000 things a grandfather is supposed to have time for. Colleen wrote letters. Every single one came back unopened. She kept them in a shoebox in her closet, and after she passed I found it, and I sat on the floor of that closet and cried like I hadn't since I was a boy. 13 years of silence. That's the ground this all grew out of. Remember it. Then, last October, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was a Sacramento number, and I figured it was somebody selling something. But something made me pick up, and it was her, Marin. Older sounding, careful, her voice doing that thing where every word gets set down gently like it might break. She said her husband had died 8 months back. A wreck on the interstate. She said Milo had been in the car. He'd survived, but something had gone quiet in him after, and he hadn't spoken since the funeral. Selective mutism, the doctors called it. Trauma, they said, would take time. And then she said the words I'd been aching to hear for 13 years. Dad, I'm sorry, you were right. About all of it. I've got nowhere else. Can we come home? I want to tell you I hesitated. I want to tell you the wise old man in me weighed it out. But the truth is I was crying before she finished the sentence, and I said yes so fast I nearly dropped the phone. Because that's the thing about a locked door. You spend years thinking you've made peace with it, and then somebody knocks, and you find out you'd have given anything, to hear that knock. They arrived on a Tuesday, the last week of October. The aspens turned gold along the drive. My daughter got out of a rental car looking thinner than I remembered, prettier too, in that tired way that makes a father want to fix everything. And then the passenger door opened and a boy climbed out. 11 years old, dark hair, his mother's eyes, and a stillness on him that no child should carry. He looked at me and didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't say a word. His mother put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Gentle Milo, this is your grandpa." And he just looked at me with those flat, quiet eyes, and my heart cracked clean in half. For the first few weeks, I thought I'd been given a second life. Maren was everything a grieving daughter come home should be. She cooked. She cleaned out the guest wing and made it a home. She'd sit with me by the fire at night and ask about her mother and cry, and I'd tell her stories and feel like I was pouring water back into a well that had gone dry years ago. She fussed over me. That's the part I keep coming back to. She fussed. My blood pressure, my heart, the pills I take morning and night. She started laying them out for me in one of those little plastic organizers with the days of the week. "You're not as young as you think, Dad," she'd say, laughing, filling my coffee. "Somebody's got to look after you now." And the boy, Milo, he didn't speak, but he watched. Lord, how that child watched. I'd catch him standing in a doorway looking at his mother with an expression I couldn't read, something older than 11. At first I thought it was grief. A boy who'd lost his father, who'd been in the car when it happened. What did I know about what that does to a mind? So I gave him room. I didn't push. I'd just leave things where he could find them, a fishing lure on the porch rail, a wooden truck I'd carved, a plate of the cinnamon toast his grandmother used to make. And slow, so slow, he started leaving things back. A drawing under my door, a rock he'd found that looked like a heart. We built a whole friendship without a single word, that boy and I, and it was the realest thing I'd felt since Colleen died. The trouble started, as trouble often does, so quiet I mistook it for age. First it was the mornings. I'd wake with my head packed in cotton, my heart doing a strange skip and stutter it had never done before, dizzy going down the stairs. One morning I nearly went over the railing and had to sit down right there on the landing until the room stopped tilting. I told myself I was getting old. 68. It happens. Maren was right there with orange juice and a cool hand on my forehead telling me to take it easy, saying, "Maybe we should see the doctor," saying it in that worried, loving voice, and I felt cared for, and I felt like a fool for having stayed away so long. Then Boone said something. Boone's my foreman, has been for 30 years, runs what's left of the working end of the ranch, and knows me better than my own reflection. We were out by the equipment barn one gray afternoon, and he watched me stumble getting into the truck, and he didn't say anything for a long minute. Then he said, "Roland, you been drinking?" I told him no, of course not before noon, not for years. And he just looked at me, this man who'd never lied to me once in 3 decades, and he said, "Something's off with you lately, been off since they came." I laughed it away, told him he was a suspicious old goat. But he didn't laugh back. He said, "Coffee tasting funny to you? Kind of bitter, kind of metal?" And I stopped, because it had, that morning it had. I'd poured it out and made a second pot and thought nothing of it. "I want to ask you something, the way I've asked myself 100 times since. When somebody you love hands you a cup of coffee, do you taste it or do you taste their love?" Because I tasted the love. Every time. I told myself Boone was being dramatic. But something in me, some old freight yard instinct that had never once steered me wrong until I let it go quiet for my daughter's sake, that something woke back up. And I did a thing I'm not proud of and will never regret. I made an appointment with Dr. Renner in town, and I didn't tell my daughter. I told her I was going to the feed store. Dr. Renner had been my physician for 20 years. I sat in his office and told him about the mornings, the dizziness, the heart doing its stutter step, the coffee. He listened the way good doctors do. Then he stopped writing and looked at me over his glasses. "Roland," he said, "when's the last time anybody ran a full panel on you? Not just the standard. Everything." I said I didn't know. He said, "I want blood today, and I want you to do something for me, and I want you to not ask why until the results come back. I want you to stop taking your pills for 3 days. All of them." And I want you to notice how you feel. I did it. I hid my pills. I palmed the ones Marin laid out and dropped them in my pocket and flushed them later. And here's the thing that turned my stomach cold. By the third morning I felt fine, better than fine, clear-headed, steady, my heart beating like a heart's supposed to. Whatever was wrong with me wasn't wrong with me. It was in the pills, or in the coffee, or in both. 3 days later Renner called. He didn't want to say it over the phone, but I made him. There were things in my blood that had no business there. A concentration of a medication I'd never been prescribed, a heart drug, in a dose that in an older man with my history could stop the whole engine and look for all the world like natural causes. "Roland," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, "somebody is poisoning you." Slowly, carefully. In a way that was meant to look like your heart simply gave out. He said the word he had to say next like it cost him. "You need to call the police." I hung up the phone and I sat in my truck in the feed store parking lot for the better part of an hour, and I did not cry, and I did not rage. I just sat there while my whole second life came apart in my hands. Because there were only 2 other people in that house, and one of them was 11 years old and couldn't speak. Now here's where a man discovers what he's made of. I could have confronted her. Everything in me wanted to. Walk in the door and say the words and watch her face. But 40 years of reading rooms told me that would get me exactly nothing, or worse, get me dead faster. She'd deny it, she'd cry, she'd cover her tracks, and if she got scared enough, she might stop being patient about it. A patient killer you can catch. A frightened one just moves quicker. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I drove home, and I walked into that kitchen, and I smiled at my daughter, and I said the trip to the feed store had done me good, and I let her hand me a cup of coffee that I later poured into a soil sample jar and drove back to Dr. Renner myself, and I went to the police. I want to tell you about Detective Farr because folks in the comments always ask, well, why didn't he just call 911? Why all the theater? Sloane Farr was maybe 40, sharp as a fence wire, and she sat me down and explained it in a way I've never forgotten. She said, "Mr. Tate, right now you have a story and a bad blood test. That's not a case. A defense attorney will say, your daughter is a devoted caregiver and you're a confused old man who got his own dosage wrong. If we arrest her now, she walks. And then you're alone in a house with someone who knows you tried to put her away. We don't move until we can prove it. And we prove it by letting her think it's working." I asked her how long. She said as long as it took. And then she asked me the question I'd been dreading. Is there anyone else in the house? And I told her about the boy. About Milo. My grandson, 11, who hadn't spoken since his father died in a wreck he'd survived. And I watched Detective Farr's face do something complicated and she said, "Careful. Mr. Tate, I need you to consider something, and I need you to not fall apart when I say it. Children who go silent after a trauma, sometimes it's grief, and sometimes it's because they saw something. Or they were told to keep quiet, or they're scared of what happens if they talk. I hadn't thought of that. God help me, I hadn't let myself think of that. Here's the piece I hadn't told Farr yet, the piece that turned this whole thing. When I built the place, I put in cameras. Not fancy, but everywhere. The barns, the drive, the workshop, the porches. A trucking man learns early that the things you don't watch are the things that walk off. I'd half forgotten about them. The feed went to an old hard drive in my office closet that I hadn't looked at in years. But that night, after Marin went to bed, I went in and I plugged in a monitor and I started scrolling back. And that's when I found out my grandson was braver than any grown man I've ever known. Because there he was on the footage from the kitchen, 3 weeks at 2 in the morning. Milo, standing on a step stool at the counter where his mother kept my pill organizer. And I watched, with my heart in my throat, as that boy carefully opened each little compartment, took a photograph of the pills inside, with a phone I didn't know he had, and then, this is the part that broke me, swapped some of them. He was replacing the poisoned ones with vitamins he'd hidden in his sock drawer. He'd been trying to save me. For weeks, in the dark, without a word. An 11-year-old protecting his grandfather from his own mother, the only way a mute child knew how. I sat in that closet and I wept for the second time that year. The next morning I did something I'd been too afraid to do. I waited until Marin left to run errands in town. She'd started leaving me alone more, testing, I understand now, seeing how weak I'd get. And I went and I sat down on the floor of Milo's room, so I'd be small, so I wouldn't loom, the way I used to get down on Colleen's level when she was hurting. And I said, "I saw the cameras, son. I know what you've been doing. I know you've been keeping me alive." And that boy looked at me, and his whole face came apart, and he threw his arms around my neck and shook, and still, he didn't speak. He just held on like I was the last solid thing in a flood. I whispered to him, "You don't have to talk. Not till you're ready. But I need you to help me. Can you do that? Can you help your grandpa put this right?" He nodded against my shoulder, and then he pulled back and he reached under his mattress and he handed me the phone. And on it were photographs, dozens, pills and dates written on scraps of paper, and one grainy shot through a doorway of his mother crushing something into a mortar at the kitchen counter late at night. That boy had built a case a detective would weep over, and he'd done it silent, in a house where the one person who was supposed to love him best was the person he had to hide it from. I gave it all to Detective Farr, and now we had something. The plan was simple and it was terrible. We would let Marin keep thinking it was working. I would keep pretending to fade. Farr's people would wait for her to make the move that turned poisoning into murder, the move that would put her away and not just in front of a jury that might feel sorry for a grieving widow. And Milo and I would play our parts, him silent, me weak, both of us acting for our lives in the one place we should have been safest. You want to know what real acting is? It isn't Hollywood. It's smiling at your child across the breakfast table while you know she's measuring how many mornings you've got left. It's letting her fuss over your pills while you palm them into a jar for the police. It's telling her you love her and meaning it, God help you, meaning it even then. Because the heart doesn't get the memo the head gets. I'd catch her looking at me sometimes with a tenderness that looked so real I'd think, surely I've got this wrong. Surely no daughter could. And then I'd remember the mortar and the pestle at 2 a.m, and I'd remember it was money. It's always money. 240 acres and a company and a bank account that would go to her the moment my heart stopped. She'd done the arithmetic on my life and found it worth more dead. The move came the second week of December. It had turned cold, the real Montana cold that gets into the seams of a house. My workshop out past the barn had an old propane heater I'd had for years, a good one, safe, with a shutoff that tripped if the flame ever went out so it couldn't fill the room with gas. I spent most afternoons out there that winter, tinkering, mostly hiding, if I'm honest, from the performance of the house. That morning, Marin was warmer than she'd been in weeks, made me a big breakfast, kissed my cheek, said she had to drive to the airport, that an old friend from Sacramento was flying in for a couple days, she'd be back by evening. And she suggested, so sweetly, that I bundle up and go work in my shop, get some peace. She knew how I loved it out there. Then she took Milo's hand and said she'd drop him at a friend's on the way. But she didn't drop him anywhere, and she didn't drive to the airport. I know now what she'd done. She'd gone out to that shop before dawn and disabled the safety shutoff on the heater and cracked the propane line just enough. The plan was for the room to fill slow while I dozed by the warmth the way an old man does, and for a spark, the shop light, the space heater's own igniter, to do the rest. A tragic accident, faulty old heater. Poor Mr. Tate, all alone out there, his heart already weak. Nobody looks hard at a fire in a rich old widower's workshop in the dead of a Montana winter. What she didn't know was that Milo had refused to get in the car. I found this out later, in pieces. He'd made a scene at the end of the drive, the kind of silent, immovable scene only a determined child can make. And she'd been in too much of a hurry to fight it, and she'd left him at the house, telling herself it didn't matter. He'd be inside, he'd be fine. She'd stopped seeing him as a person a while back. That was her mistake. She'd stopped seeing both of us. I was in the shop by 9. By 9:30 I was fuzzy. By 10 I was slumped in my chair and couldn't make my arms work, and the room had a smell to it I was too far gone to place. And I remember thinking, with a strange floating calm, that I was very tired, and that I'd just close my eyes for a minute, and that the light was going soft and gold and warm. And then the door came apart. Milo had run all the way from the house through the snow. He was 11 and small for his age, and that shop door was solid, and he threw himself against it until the old latch gave, and cold air roared in, and then he was on the floor next to me with his hands on my collar, and he was screaming. Not crying. Screaming words. The first words out of that child in over a year, and they were, "Grandpa, get up please, Mom did this, get up, get up." I have replayed that moment 10,000 times. A boy the world had written off as broken, dragging a grown man he loved out of a room built to kill him, and finding his voice at the exact instant he needed it most, not for himself, but for me. He got me to the snow. He got the door open. He got the cold air in my lungs. He shut off the propane at the tank because I'd taught him where the valve was one afternoon without either of us knowing it would ever matter. He saved my life, and then he sat in the snow holding my head in his lap, And he talked and talked, a year of silence pouring out, because he'd finally decided that whatever he was afraid of was smaller than losing me. He'd been in the car when his father died. That much was true. But it hadn't been an accident the way his mother told it, and his father hadn't been the villain of that story either. And there were things that Boy had seen and been told to never repeat. And the reason he'd stopped talking was that he'd learned that in his mother's house, the truth got you hurt. He'd gone silent to survive her, and he'd stayed silent, gathering proof in the dark, until he had enough to make sure that when he finally spoke, she couldn't call him a liar. I want to say something to every grandparent, every parent, anybody watching. When a child goes quiet, we tell ourselves stories about why. We say shy, we say grief, we say they'll grow out of it. Sometimes that's true. And sometimes a child is screaming as loud as they know how, in the only language a scared kid has left. And it's on us, the grown, the safe, the strong, to get down on the floor at their level and listen to the silence until it tells us what it means. We had 6 hours before Detective Farr expected the play to reach its end. Because here's what I hadn't told you. Marin hadn't gone to the airport for a friend. She'd bought herself a ticket. She was going to establish that she'd been out of town when the accident happened, land back in Bozeman that evening, the picture of a grieving daughter, and discover the terrible news. Farr had her flight. A little after 4 that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from the detective. Subject boarded, return flight. Landing Bozeman 7:40 tonight. Units in position. Stay in roll. So we stayed in roll. Milo and I, except now we weren't hiding from her alone in that big cold house. Now there was an unmarked car at the end of the drive and a plan and the law on our side, and a boy sitting next to me on the couch who'd used up a year of words in one afternoon and had gone quiet again. But a different quiet, a peaceful one, his head on my arm. He asked me one thing, and it near about finished me. What happens when she comes home? I told him the truth. I said the police would be waiting, that they'd take her, that she'd go away for a long, long time. He was still for a moment. And then he said, so soft, good. And then his face crumpled, and he said, good again. And this time it came out broken, and he cried, and I understood. Because whatever she'd done, whatever she was still his mother. He'd just helped send his own mother to prison, and he was 11. And both those things could be true at once. And there was no untangling them, not that night, maybe not ever. I pulled that boy into my chest and I held him and I said, this isn't your fault. You didn't do this. She did. And he said into my shirt, I know, but I still love her. And Lord, if that isn't the truest, most terrible thing a child ever said. The headlights swept the drive at 20 to 8. I stood at the window and watched the rental car come up the long grade through the snow. Milo was beside me in his chair, both of us in our places one last time. She came through the front door with her bag and that bright, warm, devoted smile, calling out, Dad, Milo, I'm home, already arranging her face for the grief she thought she was about to perform. She got 3 steps into the living room before she saw me standing there, steady on my feet, clear-eyed, not fading, not weak, not dying. She saw the boy looking straight at her. And I watched the exact half-second the whole thing came down in her mind, watched the warmth drain out of her face like water out of a cracked glass, and underneath it there was a stranger I'd never met, a cold thing that had been wearing my daughter's face for 2 months. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She just looked at me, and she said very quietly, you were supposed to be gone. Those were the last words my daughter ever said to me as a free woman, because the front door opened behind her, and Detective Farr stepped in out of the cold with 2 officers, and it was over. They read her rights while she stood there staring at me, and I made myself hold her eyes, because she was my child, and I'd brought her into this world. And the least I could do was not look away while she left the one she'd tried to steal from me. The trial came in the spring when the snow finally let go of the passes. The photographs Milo took, the swapped pills, the tampered heater, the poison in my blood, and in that coffee jar, the airline ticket, the disabled safety shutoff with her prints where a stranger's had no reason to be. It was, as Detective Farr put it, the most thoroughly documented case of its kind she'd worked in 20 years. And the reason for that, the whole reason, was an 11-year-old boy who'd decided that being silent was a small price to pay for being believed. She got 25 years. She'll be in her 60s when she comes out, about the age I am now. I attended every day of that trial, and I never missed one. And I never once got up on that stand and called it revenge. Because a reporter used that word to me on the courthouse steps, and it made me sick to my stomach. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is what I'd have felt if I'd let the anger eat me, if I'd wanted her to suffer. What I felt was heartbreak, the deep, bottomless kind, and under it cold and clean, the knowledge that a man has to protect the child who saved him even from the child who tried to kill him. That's not revenge. That's just what love has to become when it runs out of any other place to go. Milo lives with me now, out on the rise where you can see 3 ranges on a clear day. He's 12. He talks all the time these days. So much I sometimes have to tell him to slow down, and I never once mean it. He's learning to back a trailer. He caught his first trout in June, and I've got the picture on the mantel next to his grandmother's. There are hard nights he wakes up and I hear him, and I go and sit on the floor of his room the way I did that first morning. And we don't always use words, because we learned, the 2 of us, that some of the most important things get said without them. People ask me if I regret letting them come home, if I wish I'd left that door locked. And I tell them no. Because if I'd stayed hard, if I'd never picked up that phone, if I'd kept the whole world at arm's length the way I did for 40 years, I'd have died a rich and lonely old man who never knew his grandson. Instead, I nearly died, and I got a son out of it. Not by blood, by choice. And I've come to believe that's the only kind of family that ever really counts. Not the one you're handed, but the one that walks through fire and pulls you out and won't let go. So here's what I'd leave you with. Whoever you are, wherever you're listening from tonight, trust people. Love them all the way. But when your gut whispers that something's wrong, when the coffee tastes bitter, when the person who claims to care won't quite meet your eye, don't do what I did and hush that voice to keep the peace. Listen to it. It's older and wiser than the lies we tell ourselves about the people we want to be worthy of our love. And if there's a quiet child anywhere near you, get down on the floor, look them in the eye, and listen to their silence until it tells you the truth. Because sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one who hasn't said a word yet. I got my second chance not from the daughter I begged for it, but from the grandson I never knew I'd been waiting for. And every morning now when he comes down those stairs talking a mile a minute, steady on his feet, alive, I thank God I woke up in that snow with his hands on my collar and his voice in my ears. Some men get 1 family in a lifetime. I got 2. I just had to lose everything to see which one was real. And if this story stirred something in you, if you've ever had to choose between the family you were given and the family that chose you, I'd truly like to hear it. Stay to the end has always been a promise, and you kept it with me, so thank you. What comes next may be even harder to tell.